Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Tonight, we step into a story that will take you beyond what is seen, into a world where reality and fear blur together. Relax. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the cool night air around you. Listen to the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat as it slows, syncing with the silence. Imagine yourself sitting alone in your room, the lights dim, a warm blanket wrapped around you. Outside, the wind whispers gently against the window. There is no other sound, except for the faint echoes of a party in the distance. A party that shouldn't exist. A party that has been going on for a very, very long time. And tonight, you've been invited to hear its story. Welcome to the party that never ends. Moving to a new place always came with a mix of emotions. Excitement, nervousness, and in my case, a desperate need for a fresh start. The house I had chosen wasn't extravagant, just a small suburban home on the outskirts of a quiet American town. The kind of place where lawns were neatly trimmed, mailboxes stood in perfect alignment, and friendly neighbors waved as you passed by. It was exactly the kind of peace I had been looking for. The house had been surprisingly cheap, which I attributed to the usual reasons. Perhaps the previous owner had financial troubles, or maybe there had been a death in the family. I didn't ask too many questions. I just wanted a place to settle, somewhere I could work from home and escape the chaos of my previous life in the city. The moment I signed the lease, I told myself I was making the best decision possible. It wasn't until my first night that I noticed something odd. At around 11 p.m., just as I was about to sleep, I heard music. Faint at first, just a soft thumping bass line that gradually grew louder. It was the kind of music that belonged to a party, upbeat, rhythmic, pulsing with life. I assumed it was coming from a neighbor's house, maybe a family celebrating something. It didn't bother me too much, though it was unusual for such a quiet neighborhood. I got out of bed and peeked through my window, expecting to see a brightly lit house with people gathered outside, drinking, talking, maybe even dancing. But the street was empty. Most houses were dark, with only a few porch lights glowing dimly in the night. The sound, however, persisted. It was coming from the house right next to mine. That was when I remembered something. That house was supposed to be empty. Earlier that morning, when I had been unpacking, I noticed how lifeless the place looked. The grass was overgrown, the windows were dusty, and there was a faint charred smell in the air, as if something had burned there a long time ago. There had been no signs of movement, no cars in the driveway, no curtains shifting. The real estate agent never mentioned any residents, either. And yet, the music continued. I stared at the house for a long time, searching for any hint of life. There were no lights on, no shadows moving behind the curtains. Just the persistent, eerie sound of a party that had no visible guests. I told myself I was imagining things. That sound traveled weirdly in the suburbs, maybe bouncing off walls, and making it seem like it was coming from next door. Still, unease curled in my stomach. I double-checked my door locks before heading back to bed. The next morning, I decided to bring it up casually with one of the neighbors. Mrs. Callahan, a sweet old woman who lived 2 houses down, was out watering her garden when I approached her. She had one of those warm, grandmotherly smiles that made you feel at home. "Good morning, dear," she greeted cheerfully. "Settling in well?" I nodded, shifting slightly. "Yeah, it's a great place. Peaceful, too." I hesitated before adding, "Though last night, I heard some kind of party. It sounded like it was coming from the house next door." The smile on Mrs. Callahan's face faded almost instantly. She lowered her watering can, her hands tightening around the handle. "The house next door," she echoed. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. Music, people laughing. I thought maybe someone had moved in, but it seemed empty. She stared at me for a long moment, and then, in a much quieter voice, she said something that sent a chill down my spine. "They're still partying, huh?" I blinked. "What?" Mrs. Callahan glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, leaning in slightly, she whispered, "They've been partying since 1975, before the fire." A cold shiver ran through me. I let out a nervous laugh, waiting for her to clarify, to say she was joking, but she didn't. Her face remained solemn, eyes filled with something that looked eerily close to fear. "What do you mean?" I asked. She sighed, setting down her watering can and wiping her hands on her apron. "The house next door used to belong to the Decker family. They liked to entertain. They threw big parties, invited half the town. It was always loud, always crowded." She paused, her gaze distant as if she were recalling something painful. "Halloween night, 1975, she continued. "They hosted their biggest party yet. People said it was wild. Music blasting, drinks flowing, people dancing like there was no tomorrow." She exhaled slowly. "And then the fire started." I swallowed. "No one really knows how," she went on. "Some say it was an accident, a candle knocked over. Others say it was something unnatural." She shook her head. "But what we do know is that no one made it out. The entire house was engulfed in flames, and when the fire department finally managed to put it out, they found the bodies." A strange, suffocating silence settled between us. "The thing is," she said after a moment, "people still hear it. The music, the laughter. Some say they've seen shadows moving inside, figures dancing behind the windows. But whenever anyone checks, the house is empty." My mouth felt dry. I wanted to rationalize it, to come up with a logical explanation. But the unease I had felt last night made too much sense now. I forced a smile. "That's quite the story." Mrs. Callahan didn't return my smile. "You should be careful," she warned. "Sometimes, people who pay too much attention to the party get invited." A cold breeze passed through, rustling the leaves around us. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded and thanked her before heading back to my house. The entire way, my mind was racing. It was just an urban legend, right? Something to scare newcomers. A ghost story to keep kids from wandering into an abandoned house. That night, as I lay in bed, I told myself it was just that, a story. And yet, when the clock struck 11, the music started again. Louder this time. And somewhere, beneath the pulsing bass and laughter, I swore I heard something else. A voice. Whispering. Calling my name. The music started at exactly 11 p.m. I had been sitting in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from what Mrs. Callahan had told me earlier that day. I had almost convinced myself that it was just a silly ghost story, something the neighborhood passed around to keep kids away from the abandoned house. But then, the first beat of the bass thumped through the walls, making my breath hitch. It wasn't a normal kind of music. The melody was distorted, warped, like something playing off an old vinyl record that had melted slightly at the edges. The laughter followed soon after. It wasn't cheerful or casual. It was loud, shrill, almost manic. The sound of people having too much fun, their voices high-pitched and echoing unnaturally in the night air. I pulled my blanket tighter around myself, telling myself I was just overreacting. It was probably a prank. Maybe some local kids messing around with speakers. But then I heard my name. A whisper, soft but unmistakable, slipping through the layers of sound. "Come join us." I sat up so fast my head spun. My heart pounded against my ribs as I turned toward my window. The house next door was still in complete darkness. The windows were black voids, empty and lifeless. But I could hear them. The party, the voices, the music pulsing like a heartbeat. I fumbled for my phone and hit the record button. "Okay," I whispered, voice shaking. "I know I'm not crazy. I know I hear this." I recorded for a full minute, letting the strange, muffled sounds of the party fill my microphone. Then, with shaking hands, I pressed stop and played it back. For the first few seconds, all I heard was my own breathing. Then the music started, but something was different. In the recording, the sounds were clearer. The laughter was sharper, the voices more defined. I could hear people speaking, but their words were garbled, like an old radio station not quite tuned properly. Then, right at the end, just before the recording cut off, I heard it again. "My name. Come outside, my name. We saved you a drink." I dropped the phone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed curled up under my blanket, my body rigid, every muscle in me screaming to run, but I had nowhere to go. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what could be waiting outside my window, what could be watching me from the darkness of that empty house. By the time morning came, I felt like a hollowed-out version of myself. My limbs were heavy, my head foggy from exhaustion, but I needed answers. I needed to see the house up close. The morning sun did nothing to make the house next door look more inviting. If anything, it looked worse in the daylight. The exterior was worn down, the paint cracked and peeling. The yard was nothing but dry, yellowing grass. The windows, God, the windows, looked like empty sockets staring out at the world, dark even in the brightest part of the day. I stepped closer, my footsteps crunching on the dead grass. The air around the house felt wrong, stale, as if the place had been untouched by time. I hesitated, then lifted my phone and hit record again. "Okay, I'm standing outside the house now," I said under my breath. "It's empty. No lights, no movement. But last night I heard. The porch creaked. I froze. The house was empty. I knew it was empty. I hadn't seen a single person go in or out since I moved in. But just as I was about to step back, something caught my eye. There was something in the window. A figure. A woman, wearing a tattered red dress, her face obscured by the glare of the glass. She stood completely still, just beyond the curtains, as if she had been watching me this whole time. My breath hitched. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, she raised her hand and waved. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to my house, only that my hands were shaking so badly I struggled to unlock my front door. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it, then stumbled backward until my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the floor. My lungs burned from running, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I stayed there for a long time listening. The house next door was silent, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. That night I was ready. I told myself I wasn't going to be scared, that I was going to prove, once and for all, that what I was experiencing wasn't real. I set up my phone on the windowsill, recording everything. I kept my lights on, my doors locked, and I refused to let my imagination get the best of me. The music started at 11 p.m. sharp. I took a deep breath, gripping my phone like a lifeline. Then the voices came. The laughter. The whispers. Come outside. I squeezed my eyes shut. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And then, a knock. I stopped breathing. It was slow, rhythmic. 1, 2, 3, coming from my front door. I stared at it, my entire body frozen. The knocking came again, louder this time. 1, 2, 3. I reached for my phone, heart hammering in my chest. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. I opened the voice recorder and pressed play on what I had recorded earlier that evening. The audio started normal. Just the soft hum of my room, the occasional rustling of fabric as I shifted in bed. Then, at exactly 11 o'clock, the music began. I braced myself for the whispers, for my name, but that wasn't what I heard. There was another voice, a new voice, a deep, rasping breath. Right before the knocking started, a man's voice whispered into the microphone, so close, it was as if he had been right beside me. "We know you're listening." The recording cut off. The knocking stopped. Silence. I sat there, phone clutched in my hands, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. Then, just as I thought it was over, a new notification popped up on my screen. A message. No number. No sender. Just 3 words. "See you soon." I dropped the phone. Outside my window, the music kept playing. The party continued. And this time, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to ignore the invitation. I didn't sleep. Even as the music faded around 3 a.m., even as the laughter and whispers dissolved into the silence of the night, I couldn't shake the weight pressing against my chest. That message, "See you soon," burned into my brain like an iron brand. Someone, something, knew I was listening. The logical part of me screamed that this was just an elaborate prank. A neighbor messing with me. Some local kids playing into the urban legend of the never-ending party. But the other part, the one still haunted by that recording, by the voice whispering so close to my microphone, I wasn't so sure anymore. When the first rays of morning light bled through my curtains, I finally forced myself out of bed. My entire body felt heavy, as if my limbs were made of concrete. I hadn't eaten, hadn't drank anything since yesterday. My throat was raw, my hands still unsteady. I needed to do something. I needed proof. By noon, I had a plan. If I could record the music, the voices, the knocking, then I could show someone. Maybe the police, or a paranormal investigator, or even just a skeptic who could debunk the whole thing. I just needed more evidence, and that meant I had to go back to the house next door. I waited until the sun was at its highest. Something about daylight made me feel braver, as if whatever lurked in that house had less power when bathed in sunlight. The neighborhood was quiet. I didn't see Mrs. Callahan outside, or anyone else for that matter. It was as if the entire street had collectively decided to stay indoors today. I crossed the yard, my footsteps crunching over the brittle grass. The air was hot, but as I got closer to the house, a strange chill wrapped around me, crawling down my spine. I hesitated at the porch. The wood was warped and splintered, the paint peeling in long, dead strips. I reached out a hand and touched the doorknob. Cold. Too cold for the summer heat. I tried to turn it, locked. Of course. I stepped back, scanning the house. There had to be another way in. A window left open, a back door or something. Then I saw it. A side window, the glass cracked at the edges, slightly ajar. I swallowed hard. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave it alone, but I had already come this far. I had to know. I pulled the window open wider, wincing as the rusted frame groaned in protest. The space was narrow, but I managed to squeeze through, landing awkwardly inside. The air inside was thick, stale. It smelled of burnt wood, like the aftermath of a long-dead fire. Dust coated every surface, floating in thick beams of light filtering through the curtains. The living room was frozen in time, old furniture covered in tattered white sheets, a fireplace filled with ash, picture frames hanging crooked on the walls. I moved slowly, my heart pounding so loudly it echoed in my ears. Everything about this house felt wrong. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a soft creak, from upstairs. I stopped dead in my tracks. The floor above me groaned, the sound of weight shifting against old wood. My mouth went dry. Someone was up there. I forced my feet to move, inching toward the staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking into something I couldn't escape from. Halfway up, I noticed the walls were scorched, long black streaks of fire damage running along the wood, as if the house still remembered the flames that had swallowed it all those years ago. I reached the top. A long hallway stretched before me, lined with doors on either side. Some were open, revealing rooms frozen in time, dust-covered furniture, shattered mirrors, peeling wallpaper. But one door stood out, at the very end of the hall. Closed. The only door that was closed. A sick feeling churned in my stomach, but my legs carried me forward anyway. I reached out, hesitated for only a second, then wrapped my fingers around the doorknob. Ice cold. I twisted it. It opened. The room was wrong. Unlike the rest of the house, this room wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Golden light flickered from an unseen source, casting shifting shadows along the walls. The furniture was pristine. A large, vintage couch sat in the center, a glass coffee table before it. The air smelled different, too, not dusty, not burned. It smelled like perfume, like cigarette smoke, like alcohol. The room was set up like it was still waiting for guests. A party room. My stomach clenched as I took a shaky step inside. My eyes darted around, landing on something that made my breath catch in my throat. A mirror. A massive, floor-length mirror stood against the far wall. But it wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was them. Figures filled the room inside the mirror, dressed in 1970s party clothes, bell-bottoms, flashy dresses, wide-collared shirts. They were dancing, laughing, drinking from glasses filled with dark liquid. The music was blaring inside the reflection, even though the room itself was dead silent. I took a step back. One of them, a man in a sharp red suit, turned to face me. He grinned, raised his glass, and then he stepped out of the mirror. I stumbled backward, my scream lodged in my throat. His shoes clicked against the floor as he approached, his grin too wide, too wrong. "We were wondering when you'd finally accept the invitation," he said, voice smooth like honey. My body refused to move. "We've been waiting for you," he continued, tilting his head. "Come on now, don't be shy." He reached out a hand. Behind him, the other figures in the mirror turned. One by one, they all looked at me. Their eyes were wrong. Black. Empty. "Come on," the man in red urged. "Dance with us." My body screamed run. I spun, sprinted out of the room, down the hallway, taking the stairs two at a time. Behind me, I heard footsteps, many footsteps. They were following me. I didn't stop. I hit the ground floor, charged toward the window I had climbed through. As I dove through the opening, something grabbed my ankle. Cold, dry, fingers wrapped around my skin. I kicked, hard, and then I was outside, collapsing onto the dead grass. My ankle throbbed, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, until I was back in my house, locking every door, every window. My breath came in ragged gasps. My vision blurred. Outside, the house next door stood still. Silent. Empty. The party was over. For now. But I knew deep in my bones I had been invited. And sooner or later, they would expect me to accept. I locked myself inside my house. Every door, every window. I even slid the heavy wooden table in front of the front door, as if that would make a difference. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. The invitation wasn't just a whisper on the wind anymore. They had seen me. They had touched me. I sat on the floor of my living room, my back pressed against the couch. The whole world felt off balance, like I was trapped in a fevered dream that refused to end. I should have left. I should have packed a bag, jumped in my car, and driven until my gas tank was empty. But I knew it wouldn't matter. You don't just walk away from something like this. They wouldn't let me. I pulled my phone out with trembling fingers. Maybe someone else would believe me. Maybe I wasn't losing my mind. I opened the voice recorder, heart hammering as I replayed last night's recording, the one with the knocking. I braced myself for the whisper, for the chilling rasp of that deep voice saying, "We know you're listening." But that wasn't what I heard. The recording had changed. The knocking was still there, slow and rhythmic, but this time there was something new. A song. Soft at first, then growing louder. A slow, eerie tune played on an old piano, the kind you'd hear in a dimly lit lounge back in the 70s. Then voices, chanting, whispering in unison. "We've saved you a seat." The knocking grew louder. "We've saved you a drink." Louder. "Come inside." My name. Then a final knock, sharp, forceful. And silence. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My blood ran ice cold. They knew my name. They knew my name. The breath in my throat turned shallow and jagged. My body screamed at me to run, to get out of this house, but I was paralyzed. Then, something slammed against my front door. Bang. The whole house shook. Bang. The wooden table I had pushed in front of the door scraped forward an inch. Bang. My pulse roared in my ears. I clamped both hands over my mouth, trying to smother the gasping sounds I was making. And then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Something shifted outside the door. A faint shuffle. A whisper. Then, the sound of paper sliding beneath the door. I sat there for what felt like an eternity before I forced my body to move. I crawled forward, my entire body trembling as I reached for the paper. My fingers brushed the edge. The texture was rough, old. My hands shook as I lifted it, unfolded it. It was an invitation. Aged yellow paper. Cursive writing in dark ink. "You are cordially invited to a night of celebration at 1046 Holloway Drive. Date, October 31st, 1975. Dress to impress. Bring your dancing shoes." At the bottom, a short note was scrawled in fresh red ink. "We've been waiting for you, my name. Don't be late." My stomach twisted. The paper slipped from my fingers. They were inviting me to a party that happened nearly 50 years ago, and they expected me to show up. I spent the next few hours in a state of pure, electric terror. Every time I blinked, I saw the faces in the mirror, the black eyes staring back at me, the man in the red suit, grinning as he raised his glass. I needed answers. I grabbed my laptop and started digging. I searched for 1046 Holloway Drive fire. Nothing. Then I tried Holloway Drive Halloween fire, 1975. And there it was. An article from the local newspaper, dated November 1st, 1975. Tragedy strikes Halloween party as fire claims 23 lives. My throat closed up. I clicked the article. What was supposed to be a night of fun and celebration turned into horror last night, as a house party at 1046 Holloway Drive went up in flames. According to authorities, the fire started around 1:45 a.m., trapping many of the partygoers inside. The cause of the fire remains unknown. Witnesses reported seeing strange lights and hearing music from the house even after the fire had reduced it to ash. I kept reading. One survivor, Henry Callahan, claims that the party was never normal to begin with. In a chilling statement, he told police that the guests weren't human, describing them as having black, empty eyes and moving like puppets on invisible strings. Henry fled before the fire consumed the house, but he swore that as he ran, he heard them laughing, like they knew they were never really going to die. Callahan, Mrs. Callahan. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door. She answered on the second knock. Mrs. Callahan squinted at me, her face pinched in irritation. "It's late," she grumbled. "What do you?" I shoved the invitation toward her. Her breath caught. I watched as all the color drained from her face, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. "Oh God," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "You knew someone who was there, didn't you?" Mrs. Callahan didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door wider, ushering me inside. She sat me down at the kitchen table, then lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "I hoped they wouldn't notice you," she murmured. "But they always do, don't they?" My stomach clenched. "Tell me everything," I pleaded. She exhaled a long breath, staring at the invitation like it was something toxic. "I knew Henry," she admitted. "He was my brother." A lump formed in my throat. He was never the same after that night. Said he could still hear the music, even miles away. Swore they were calling to him. My parents thought he was just traumatized, but I believed him. She fixed me with a hard stare. "They want you now," she said grimly. "They want you to join them." My fingers curled into fists. "How do I stop it?" She shook her head. "You don't." I refused to accept that. "There has to be a way," I pressed. "A way to break whatever this is." Mrs. Callahan hesitated. Then slowly she said, "There's only one way to end a party that never stopped." She met my gaze, eyes full of something that sent a deep, cold fear through me. "You have to be the one to blow out the candles." I didn't understand at first, but then it clicked. The fire. The party never truly ended. And maybe, just maybe, it needed to burn again. I sat there, frozen. Mrs. Callahan's words echoed in my head, a slow, creeping realization slithering through my mind. You have to be the one to blow out the candles. She wasn't speaking in riddles. She was telling me to burn the house down. Again, I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. "That's crazy," I whispered. Mrs. Callahan crushed her cigarette into a glass ashtray. Her hands were shaking. "It's the only way," she muttered. I felt lightheaded. My fingers dug into my thighs. "You want me to commit arson?" "It's not arson if they're already dead," she said flatly. I stared at her, searching for any hint of a joke, some sign that this was just the ramblings of an old woman who had lost too much. But she was serious, dead serious. "You don't understand," she said, voice tight. "That house isn't just haunted. It's a trap, a loop. That fire never really ended. It just froze. Like a record skipping, the party keeps going, keeps pulling people in. And now," her eyes flicked to the invitation still clutched in my hands. "Now they've chosen you." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. "How do you know this will work?" Mrs. Callahan sighed, rubbing her temples. "Because Henry tried to end it before. And he failed." Something sharp twisted in my gut. "He went back," she continued, "years later. Said he was going to finish what the fire started. But he never made it out. The house took him, just like it takes anyone who tries to fight it." I exhaled shakily. My mind raced. If I went back in there, if I relit the fire, would I even make it out? I left her house in a daze, my thoughts spiraling. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. Shadows stretched long across the pavement. I barely made it inside before the music started again. Soft at first, distant. A single piano note floating through the air, as if someone had just placed their fingers on the keys. Then, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. I shut all my curtains, but it didn't stop the feeling of being watched. I needed to decide. Was I really going to do this? By midnight, I had a plan. A terrible plan. I spent an hour scouring my garage, my hands shaking as I grabbed an old gas can. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. Enough to finish whatever had started in that house almost 50 years ago. I couldn't let them pull me in. I couldn't let the party go on. I packed a lighter in my pocket, a flashlight, a pocket knife, though I doubted it would do anything against whatever was in that house. Then I waited, and the party next door raged on. At 3 a.m., I left my house. The night was cold, far too cold for summer. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled liquor, as if the party was leaking into reality. The house stood alive. Golden light flickered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Shadows danced inside. Music swelled, weaving through the night like a siren song. I stepped onto the porch. The second my foot hit the wood, the door swung open on its own. I almost turned back right then. Almost. But I couldn't. Because inside, at the end of the darkened hallway, stood the man in the red suit, waiting for me. His grin stretched too wide. His black eyes shimmered like ink. He lifted a hand, gesturing for me to come in. Right on time, he purred. I swallowed my fear and stepped inside. The house was alive. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything changed. No dust, no broken furniture, no scorched walls. Instead, I was standing in a perfectly preserved 1970s mansion, filled with guests. People in bell-bottoms and flashy dresses twirled across the floor, their laughter ringing through the air. The scent of whiskey, perfume, and cigarettes thickened the room. I wasn't supposed to be here. I gripped the gas can tightly, my knuckles turning white. I had one chance to end this. The man in the red suit approached, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "Drink," he offered, holding out a crystal glass filled with something dark. My mouth felt like sandpaper, but I shook my head. His grin widened. "Come now," he urged, tilting his head. "We've been waiting so long. Won't you enjoy yourself? Just for a little while." I clenched my jaw. "No," I said. "I came here to end this." The party stilled. All around me, the guests froze, their movements snapping to an unnatural halt. Slowly, one by one, they all turned to face me. Dozens of eyes. Black. Empty. The man in red sighed, shaking his head. "A shame," he murmured. "You would have made an excellent guest of honor." And then, the lights went out. The house came alive. The walls groaned. The floor shifted beneath my feet. Hands reached from the shadows, grabbing at my arms, my clothes. I thrashed, swinging the gas can wildly. I had one chance. I ripped the cap off, gasoline sloshing onto the floor. The air filled with the sharp, acrid scent. The house didn't like that. The hands tightened. Fingers like iron clamps dug into my skin. I fumbled for the lighter, my breath coming in frantic gasps. A voice whispered in my ear, deep, rasping, and human. "Stay with us." I struck the flint. A tiny flame sparked to life. The hands jerked back. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the lighter. Whoosh. Flames erupted, devouring the gasoline-soaked floor in a violent blaze. The house screamed. The guests shrieked, high-pitched, inhuman wails that rattled my skull. The man in red staggered back, his suit catching fire, his perfect grin finally breaking. I ran. Smoke choked my lungs as I tore through the hallway. The house was collapsing, walls peeling, floors splintering. I hit the front door at full speed, and suddenly I was outside. The air was cold. The house stood before me, its windows blazing like the gates of hell. The music warped, slowing, distorting. Then it stopped. For the first time in decades, the party was over. I stumbled backward, coughing. My skin was burning, my clothes reeking of smoke. And then, through the flames, I saw him, the man in red, standing in the inferno, smiling. His lips moved, forming silent words. I couldn't hear them, but I understood. This wasn't over. Not yet. I stood there, gasping for air, my lungs filled with smoke and fear. The house burned like a funeral pyre, flames licking at the sky, embers swirling in the air like fireflies. But I barely noticed any of it. Because through the inferno, through the twisted, writhing shadows, he was still there. The man in the red suit, smiling, his black, empty eyes locked onto mine, his face twisted in something that was not quite human. The fire should have consumed him. It should have reduced him to ash like everything else. But he just stood there, unburned, unbothered. And then he raised his hand, not in a wave, not in surrender, but in a toast. A crystal glass of deep, red liquid tilted toward me. And then he drank. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey me. The flames roared higher, swallowing the roof, cracking the windows. The house shuddered, collapsing in on itself, sending up plumes of thick, black smoke. But even as the fire raged, I heard it. The music, faint, distant, as if it was still playing somewhere just beyond the veil of reality. The party wasn't over. A horrible, icy dread settled in my stomach. I staggered backward, my vision swimming. The heat from the flames seared my skin, but I couldn't look away. I had done everything right. I had followed Mrs. Callahan's advice. You have to blow out the candles. Well, I had. And yet, he was still here. The man in red lowered his glass, licking his lips as if savoring the drink. Then he tilted his head at me, his grin stretching just a little too wide. And he whispered something. I couldn't hear it over the roar of the fire. But I felt it, like icy fingers sliding down my spine. And then, he stepped backward, vanishing into the collapsing house as the last of the roof caved in. The world around me fell silent. All that remained was the crackle of flames and the distant wail of approaching sirens. I should have felt relief. I didn't. The fire department arrived minutes later, red and blue lights flashing against the night. Firefighters rushed past me, shouting commands, dragging hoses. Someone grabbed my shoulder, shaking me. A paramedic. Are you okay? He asked, his voice urgent. I nodded, though my body was still trembling. Were you inside? I hesitated. No, I lied. He frowned but didn't press. He was already moving on to more important things. The fire burned for hours. By dawn 10:46, Holloway Drive was nothing but charred ruins. They would say it was an accident, that the old abandoned house had finally given in to time, that maybe squatters had left something burning inside. No one would question it. No one but me. Because as I stood there, watching the smoldering wreckage, I felt it. A presence, lingering, watching, and then from deep within the ashes, I heard it, a single note on a piano, soft, faint, as if the party had only just begun. I barely slept for the next few days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the man in red, standing in the flames, drinking to me. I kept telling myself it was over, that the house was gone, that the ghosts had burned with it. But then, the invitation came back. It arrived on my doorstep 3 days later, folded neatly in an unmarked envelope. The same yellowed paper, the same cursive script. You are cordially invited to a night of celebration at 1046 Holloway Drive. Date, October 31st, 1975. But this time, there was a new line at the bottom. We know what you did. You can't stop the music. My blood turned to ice. The house was gone, but the party never ended. I grabbed the invitation, ripping it apart, shredding it into tiny pieces. But as soon as I let go, as soon as the scraps fluttered to the ground, they vanished, like they had never existed. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The silence in my house felt too deep. And then, a single knock on my front door. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. Another knock. Then, a voice. Deep, amused, familiar. It's rude to leave a party early, you know. I ran. I packed a bag and left town that night. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't leave a note. I just drove, speeding down the highway until the familiar roads turned foreign. I booked a motel room in a city hours away, paying in cash. I turned my phone off. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The nightmares still came. The music still played at the edge of my hearing. But I convinced myself I was safe. Until I turned on the TV. A local news broadcast. The anchor's face was calm, detached. Mysterious fire breaks out at Holloway Drive property once again. My stomach dropped. The screen showed the ruins of the house, or what was left of them. The firefighters had put out the flames, but the shadows still clung to the wreckage like something alive. And then, the camera cut to a man standing just beyond the caution tape. A man in a red suit, grinning, raising a glass to the camera. The footage glitched. For a brief second, his face warped, stretching unnaturally, his mouth splitting wider than humanly possible. And then, static. The screen flickered back to the news anchor, unaware of what had just been shown. But I had seen it, and I knew. I could run. I could burn the house down again and again. But it wouldn't matter, because the party never really stopped. And they would always find me, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran. Somewhere beyond the veil of reality, the music was still playing, and my seat at the table was still waiting, watching. And then, from deep within the ashes, I heard it, a single note on a piano, soft, faint, as if the party had only just begun. I barely slept for the next few days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the man in red, standing in the flames, drinking to me. I kept telling myself it was over, that the house was gone, that the ghosts had burned with it. But then, the invitation came back. It arrived on my doorstep 3 days later, folded neatly in an unmarked envelope. The same yellowed paper, the same cursive script. You are cordially invited to a night of celebration at 1046 Holloway Drive. Date, October 31st, 1975. But this time, there was a new line at the bottom. We know what you did. You can't stop the music. My blood turned to ice. The house was gone, but the party never ended. I grabbed the invitation, ripping it apart, shredding it into tiny pieces. But as soon as I let go, as soon as the scraps fluttered to the ground, they vanished, like they had never existed. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The silence in my house felt too deep. And then, a single knock on my front door. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. Another knock. Then, a voice. Deep, Amused. Familiar. It's rude to leave a party early, you know. I ran. I packed a bag and left town that night. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't leave a note. I just drove, speeding down the highway until the familiar roads turned foreign. I booked a motel room in a city hours away, paying in cash. I turned my phone off. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The nightmares still came. The music still played at the edge of my hearing, but I convinced myself I was safe, until I turned on the TV. A local news broadcast. The anchor's face was calm, detached. Mysterious fire breaks out at Holloway Drive property once again. My stomach dropped. The screen showed the ruins of the house, or what was left of them. The firefighters had put out the flames, but the shadows still clung to the wreckage like something alive. And then, the camera cut to a man standing just beyond the caution tape. A man in a red suit, grinning, raising a glass to the camera. The footage glitched. For a brief second, his face warped, stretching unnaturally, his mouth splitting wider than humanly possible. And then, static. The screen flickered back to the news anchor, unaware of what had just been shown. But I had seen it, and I knew. I could run. I could burn the house down again and again. But it wouldn't matter, because the party never really stopped, and they would always find me, no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran. Somewhere beyond the veil of reality, the music was still playing, and my seat at the table was still waiting. The doors slammed shut behind me, sealing my fate. The sound echoed through the grand hall, but no one else seemed to notice. The guests, dozens, maybe hundreds, continued dancing, laughing, drinking, their voices blending with the jazz band playing in the corner. I stood frozen at the entrance, my breath hitching in my throat. I was inside the house, but not the ruins, not the smoldering wreckage I had left behind. I was in 1046 Holloway Drive on the night of October 31st, 1975. The house was whole again, restored to its former opulence. A golden chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the ballroom. The air smelled of expensive cigars, whiskey, and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit hidden beneath the perfume of celebration. The guests looked normal at first, dressed in their finest 70s fashion, their faces painted with wide grins. But as I took a step forward, I realized the truth. Their eyes were empty, black voids that swallowed the light. I stiffened. My stomach churned. I wanted to turn back, to bolt for the doors, but I knew they wouldn't open. I had accepted the invitation. There was no going back. The man in the red suit descended the grand staircase, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring every second. His grin widened when our eyes met. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice velvety smooth. "I was beginning to think you'd never return." I swallowed hard. My hands curled into fists. "I don't belong here." His smile didn't falter. "Oh, but you do. You've been part of this celebration from the moment you first heard the music." The guests stopped dancing. All at once, their heads snapped toward me in eerie unison. The band kept playing. The music swirled through the air, but their bodies remained perfectly still, as if frozen in time. My pulse pounded. I shouldn't be here. But before I could make a move, the man in red stepped closer. "I know what you're thinking," he mused. "You burned the house down. Twice. You tried to run. You even tried to pretend none of this was real." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You poor thing. Don't you see? The house is not the party. The party is forever." His words sent a shiver down my spine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crystal glass filled with deep red liquid, just like before. "Drink," he urged, offering it to me. I shook my head. The smile on his lips twitched, just for a second. The guests turned fully toward me, their hollow eyes locked onto my face. I could feel them pressing in, their hunger palpable. I stepped back. My breath came in sharp gasps. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. The music seemed louder now, faster. The chandeliers flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The scent of decay thickened. And then, the guests moved. They didn't walk. They glided, their feet barely touching the floor. Closing in. I spun toward the doors, but they had disappeared. Nothing but an endless wall stretched behind me. Panic surged through me. My chest tightened. I was trapped. The man in red sighed, almost disappointed. I was hoping you'd be more cooperative. He snapped his fingers. A wave of cold washed over me. The lights dimmed. The music distorted, slowing down, warping into something inhuman. And the guests, they changed. Their elegant suits and gowns shriveled into rotting fabric. Their skin darkened, cracked, peeling away in long, curling strips. Their hollow eyes remained locked onto me as their lips stretched into unnatural grins, their teeth blackened and jagged. I let out a choked sob. They weren't guests. They were the dead. The ones who had been here since 1975. The ones who had never left. I staggered back, my mind screaming at me to wake up, to run, to do something. But my body wouldn't obey. The man in red took another step closer, still holding out the drink. "Drink," he repeated. I shook my head violently. His smile vanished. In a blur, he lunged. His fingers closed around my wrist, ice cold and wrong, his grip tightening with unnatural strength. I screamed. The guests descended on me, their rotting hands reaching, clawing, pulling me toward the ballroom floor. I fought. I kicked. I clawed at them, my nails raking across decomposing flesh. But it didn't matter. They were too strong. The music pounded in my skull, driving me to the brink of madness. The air grew thick, suffocating me in a haze of perfume and death. And then, everything stopped. I was falling through the floor, through darkness, through an endless abyss. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of a desolate highway. The engine was running. The radio played static. My heart slammed against my ribs as I looked around, gasping for breath. The sky outside was still dark. Had it been a dream? No. My hands were shaking. My skin was cold. And then, I saw it. The invitation, sitting neatly on the passenger seat. I grabbed it, my breath catching in my throat. Same elegant script. Same cursed date. But this time at the bottom, "See you next year." I choked on my own breath. I threw the invitation out the window. But as soon as I turned my head back toward the seat, it was there again, unfolded, waiting. A cold, sinking realization settled over me. I hadn't escaped. I had just been given time. Time to live. Time to pretend I was free. Until next Halloween. Because the party at 1046 Holloway Drive never ends. And sooner or later, I would be back. Forever. The party is over, for now. As the echoes of laughter and music fade into the night, you find yourself back in the quiet comfort of your own space. The air is still, the world is calm, and the only sound left is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Perhaps it was just a story, a fleeting tale whispered in the dark. Or maybe somewhere out there, the party still goes on, waiting for its next guest. Before you drift off to sleep, tell me, if you received an invitation to a place like this, would you accept? Or would you run? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if this story kept you up tonight, or if you'll sleep soundly despite it. And if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Rest well, and until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and whatever you do, listen carefully to the sounds of the night.